The second presentation is on operational procedure. This is a repeat of a presentation given to us by Camille Peres, an associate professor of environmental and occupational health at Texas A&M University. She's also the assistant director of human systems engineering with Mary Kay O'Connor process safety engineering. The work being done on reducing systematic failure caused by operational procedure is being adopted by some progressive companies and should be considered as guidance on this, on our document.
So thrilled to be back here again to talk with you all about what we really think systematic error is with regard to humans, and more importantly, how can we address it? So this is a picture that I like to, it's my new favorite picture to present in these talks. Because it's not one that shows an up-close picture of the explosion and the fire and all of that sort of stuff, but it really is more about the workers, and it is forcing us to look at this through the lens of those workers who are looking at the. I'm imagining that this is a waypoint that they have gone to, and that they're looking at the explosion and wondering how many people were hurt, how many people were killed, if anybody was killed, is it somebody that they know? They might be worrying about their jobs. They are looking at this plume of smoke. Is it done? Are there going to be any more explosions? So you're really, I think, for me, this image made me see it through the eyes of these people that are definitely the sharp end of the spear. And I think that that's important for us to remember, that all of these efforts, at least from my motivation, are about these folks. Now, granted, if we don't make our efforts so that there's a business to run, because these businesses are there, of course, to make money, then that's not going to make any difference. One of the things that's really remarkable about these industries is it's one of the few, these are some of the few industries where individuals can go and make a living wage, and at this point have maybe a high school diploma or 1 or 2 years of junior college, and have good insurance, support their families. And so I think it's beholden to us to make sure that they can actually live their lives and enjoy those benefits. So I think that it's really important for us to continue to see some of these incidents and issues through these eyes. And this is, in fact, many of you will know, and maybe were part of this, about the Phillips petroleum explosion. And this is particularly motivating for me because this is where, unfortunately, Mary Kay O'Connor lost her life. And her husband, with the proceeds that he got, started the Mary Kay O'Connor Process Safety Center. And this is where I began my journey with introducing human factors into process safety. And I won't go into a lot of details with this, but this thing that fascinates me is that the initial blast registered 3.5 on the Richter scale. And I think we have to, for those younger folks that are coming into this industry, like the safety professionals that I train, that is just, that's on the Richter scale. We're talking earthquake kind of magnitude. And so these are the kinds of explosions that we're talking about. And so when we talk about process safety, which you all know about, right? This is what is your bread and butter. It's about understanding the risk and predicting problems, and being able to look at these kind of accidents, the loss scenarios. What are the designs and the right LOPA to control these risks? And then controlling the risks generally with the design of the facilities, but also on a day-to-day basis. Control the original design and maintain that established LOPA to prevent these kinds of incidents. And then to analyze actual problems and determine weaknesses. Understand through root cause analysis of actual problems, identify these weaknesses. And so what you all have been determining and experiencing is that the human is the risk, that a lot of times you've been doing lots of analysis on the machines and maintenance and all of that, and that it seems like every time there's a big problem, a human was standing right there. And so we know that people make mistakes. This is not new. Human error, this term has been around for a long, long time. This one on the bottom right is my new particular favorite. And so when we're even really good at categorizing them. So we've got the performance influencing factors. Is it an inadvertent error? Is it a deliberate error? We can talk about the ever-present Swiss cheese model, and whether or not these things all lined up. So we're really good about talking about how people can screw up. But in process safety, we're not very good at predicting how humans make errors, and therefore we're not very good at preventing them. And that's because we haven't been looking at why people make errors in process safety. But in human factors, that's what we do, is we look at the design of this human artifact or human machine interface and when it's broken and how do we need to fix it. And so I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit. So Alphonse Chapanis, in some worlds, is considered the father of human factors. And he was considered an engineering psychologist and was brought in during World War II when they were having trouble with the B-17s. And pilots, when they were landing after combat missions, the pilots and the co-pilots were retracting the landing gear instead of the landing flaps. So I want you to keep in mind that when you're the hardest parts of flying a plane are takeoff and landing, even today. And so these are people that are not only doing one of the hardest parts of flying a plane, but they're coming back from a combat mission, which is extraordinarily stressful. And so you were talking about stress issues before with Ranjana's presentation. And so they would, of course, immediately say, this is pilot error. We need to retrain them. And of course, these pilots have been unbelievably well trained. So take them back to training, and then they go back onto their combat mission after training. And guess what? These things kept happening again and again and again. So Dr. Chapanis sat in the cockpit and sat and saw what was going on. And he found that there were two identical toggle switches that were side by side. One was for landing gear and the other one was for landing flaps. And so it's not shocking that during one of the most stressful times of operating a plane, when somebody is already remarkably stressed and probably fatigued, that they might confuse these two identical switches. And so as many of the folks in your chemical plants or refineries would say, what engineer decided that this was a good idea to put these two things right here together that look so much alike? And so he called this designer error, not pilot error. And so they changed the switch design and location, and the error rate went to 0. Angela, did you have a question for me? Okay, no. So, so this began this idea of the science of human factors, and the idea that we want to look at how is the interface designed to support what we know people are going to do. We know that this is a stressful moment. We know that this is a hard task. We need to design this interface to better support what people are going to do. This is a predictable error. Therefore, it's a preventable error. So I'm going to tell you how I unpack the science of human factors. And I use what I call the interactive behavior triad. And we look at the tasks that somebody's doing, which is the goals, the steps, knowledge, skills, that sort of thing, how frequently they're doing, the hazards, the criticality. We look at attributes of the person who's doing that task, what kind of parts of information processing they're doing, what parts of their psychomotor are they using, their upper extremities, are they fatigued, what are their motivations? And then I look at the attributes of the context. Are they inside or are they outside? Is there a good safety climate or not? What are the tools and the artifacts that they're using? And with all of this information, then we're better able to predict what is their interactive behavior going to be. And so let me give you an example like that about this. Let's stick with the pilot example. So the task here is to fly the plane, and specifically to land the plane. So the goal is to make sure that the landing gear stays down, that the landing flaps stay in the position that they're supposed to be. There's a specific sequence of steps. You have to have a lot of knowledge. You do this relatively frequency, lots of hazards, very critical. So this is our, sort of an example of what we're talking about. So the person, there's a lot of information processing going on. So you have to have a high working memory going on. You're using your upper extremities to do this. The pilots are very fatigued. The demographics, these are young hotshot pilots. They know everything. They're so cool. They've been really well trained. They've got a little bit of a tiny bit of a God complex going on. But they're also, one of the things, they're using a lot of visual scanning. They've got to be able to see what's going on, and they've got to be able to see it from far away. They've also got to be able to process a lot of information visually, and then keep that, be able to predict what's happening based on the information that they're seeing visually. And they also might be really, really tired. And so, so this is all attributes of the person that is doing this task that we need to think about. And then what are the attributes of the context? The physical environment, it may be dark outside. Have you ever tried to see a runway when it's really, really high up in the sky and it's really dark outside? It's hard. It could be that so the psychosocial piece of it, we're in war. They don't want to do anything to screw up, because if they break a plane, then that's one less plane to get the bad guys. So they're under a lot of pressure to not screw up. But then the tools they have are bad tools. And so with this situation, this is a very predictable situation here. And so this is one where we want to have that it's reliable, that that's not going to happen. So I want to talk a little bit about the way humans work and how that can help us identify this systemic failure that we can in fact predict. I'm going to talk about information processing, some fundamentals of it, organizational behavior, and then some of the research that we've done on procedural systems. So information processing, this is basically how do we get information in our head, what do we do with it once it's there, and how do we make decisions based on it. One of my favorite ways of describing information processing is showing visual illusions. Now, it's very difficult to do videos in this system, so I'm just going to walk you through some images of this. And so this, you can see on the left, you've got this rectangle right here, the black one, and towards the right, you've got this red-looking square. But I'm going to walk you through somebody moving. This is actually a black piece of paper. On top of that, the piece to the left. Sorry, I got my left and right mixed up. And as you watch them move, you'll see that in fact those were the same shapes. And because of the way our mind perceives depth perception, very basically, we perceive that this one on the left is actually a rectangle because it looks like it's going away from us. And we look at this one that's on the right and it looks like a square because it looks a little bit fatter. But in fact, those are the same shapes. And that has to do with the way we perceive depth, and it's what's called the bottom-up processing. So I'm going to show you some more stuff that kind of gives you an idea about how the humans process information. So this is a little bit of a game. If we were face-to-face, what I would have you do is raise your hand to answer the question. But we don't do that, so you're just going to have to, I'm just going to trust you. It's your word. And what you do is I want you to think in your head how long it takes you to answer this question. The question is there a blue diamond? Yes or no? When you know the answer, yes there is or no there isn't, then make that note to yourself. Okay, how long did it take me to find the answer to the question? Okay, question is there a blue diamond? Yes or no? Okay, probably most of you know the answer to the question now. And the answer to the question is yes, there is a blue diamond. It's right here. So think about how long it took you to find that blue diamond. Okay, same game. We're going to do it again. I want you to think about how long, I want you to note to yourself how long it takes you to answer the question, is there a blue diamond, yes or no? Okay, and so most of you probably have the answer now that there is not a blue diamond. So there's not a blue diamond on the screen. So most of the time, and in experiments that have been replicated a billion times, probably not a billion, but probably pretty close to it, the second time takes longer. And the reason that the second time takes longer is you have to look at every single object. The first time, you only have to look until you find the blue diamond. So if the object is not there, it's reliably going to take people longer. Sometimes it won't, but most of the time it will. So that's one of those perceptual phenomenon, kind of like the old adage that you quit looking the second you the object was in the, whatever you were looking for around the house was in the last place you looked. Well, it's like, well, of course it was, because you quit looking for it. But when you're looking, having to look in a sea of stuff, if the target's not there, it's going to take you a lot longer to find it. Okay, same game. Is there a blue diamond? Take a note to yourself about how long it takes you to find the answer. Okay, probably most of you have identified that there is a blue diamond. It's right here. And this still takes more time. And that's because there's a lot more items to look at. And so this is the idea that it's serial search. You have to look at each of the items. So the more items there are, the longer it takes. So the more stuff on a display, the longer it's going to take you to find something. So if there's an alarm going off and it's a visual alarm and you're not exactly sure where it is, and if you have a whole bunch of them on the screen, it's going to take you a long time to find it, right? So that's kind of the idea. This is the what's happening here is what's called a serial search. Okay, same game, but now what I want you to do is notice whether or not there's a red shape. And I want you to pay attention to how long it takes you to find the answer. Is there a red shape? I would imagine instantly found that there was a red shape right here. Now, what about this? There's a lot of items on here. There's just as many items here as we had in this one right here, but this one is immediately obvious. And so this doesn't follow that previous rule. That's called the classic pop-out effect. And this is called parallel processing. And what this means is that we process color in parallel with shape. So I can look at color and ignore shape, or I can pay attention to shape and ignore color. So if you tell me find something red, I can ignore what shape it is. If you tell me to find a square, I can ignore what color it is and really expedite how quickly I can find an object. So here's something I want you to do. Here's another game. So again, I want you to figure out yes or no, does anything change about the display? So here's the first display. Here's the second display. Just kind of note to yourself whether you saw there's a change. Now, same game. Note whether or not you there's a change about the display. Here's the first display. Here's the second display. So what's going on with this? So both sets of display, when I said first display, second display, first display, second display, both of them were exactly the same. And there was a change. There was a little item added on the bottom left. But for the second set, it was really easy to see that change. For the first set, it was really hard to see that change. And the reason is that first set has an image in between them. And what that image does is it erased what's called the iconic memory. So we have, at the neuronal level, the neurons in your eyes actually has, for a few milliseconds, a memory of what you're looking at. so you can access that. But if you erase it with something else, then it's not going to be helpful to you. But if it's still active, even if things have changed, then you can access it. It makes it really easy to see any changes in your environment. So I want you to think about situations when operators are having to monitor displays for changes and are constantly back and forth between monitors, particularly if they're having to monitor for sub changes, how that would be a setup for failure for them, because they're constantly, every time they look away from that monitor, they're erasing their iconic memory, and they are not going to be able to recall what they saw in that memory before. So what we're talking about here are bottom-up and top-down processes. These are automatic processes. They are not conscious decisions. This is just how human information processing systems work. This is, you all just experienced it. And this is what the workers that are in these facilities are experiencing. So bottom-up processing is processing sensory information directly. What you see, what you smell, what you taste, what you hear, what you touch. It's based only on the incoming information, And it refers to the way it's built up from the smallest pieces of sensory information. Now, top-down processing means that it's driven by cognition. The brain applies what it knows and expects, and it fills in the blanks. And it's based on experience, and it's based on context. So I'm going to give you an example. So here is a shape, and you might imagine that this is a number, or you might imagine that this is a letter, or maybe you imagine it's something else entirely. In this context, it's pretty easy to imagine that it's a 13. That's not hard at all. In this context, it's really easy to imagine that it's a B. That's not very difficult at all. So whatever you imagined it to be right here, that's bottom-up processing, because only thing you're using is the information, is the actual stimuli that you have visually available. Whatever we see it being right here is clearly top-down, because you're using the context that's around it. We've got a 12 and a 14, and this can be 13. That's a 1, that's a 3, no problem. We have an A and a C. And, oh yeah, this could be a B. This is the side of it. This is the other ends of it. And so, so that's the difference between top down and bottom up. And so when we talk about Chapanis's design errors, you need to think about that any system or display that is contrary to bottom up or top down processing will reliably result in errors, just like World War II B-17. We can predict these errors, therefore we should prevent these errors. And you have to have human factors professionals during designs and operations. And so we were talking about the human reliability analysis and QRA analysis. And I think part of this is more about, if you haven't done this, if there hasn't been good design put in, then what's your risk factor? If you have bad design, then I think you've got a big, much bigger risk factor. And so that's what we're talking about right here. Okay, so we just talked about information processing. Now I want to talk a little bit about organizational behavior. We're not going to talk a lot about this, just a little bit, because this isn't my specialization really, but it's important to understand. And Ranjana mentioned it a bit too. So people will always do what's rewarded, and they will always avoid what's punished. That's what people do. So formal policies are those behaviors that are espoused by leaders. So this is what the signs on the walls are, and what all of the things that people say, and those policies that are written down. But the enacted policies are those behaviors that are actually reinforced or punished. So whatever you've got in all of these nice books right here are great. But what actually happens out on the floor, or out with regard to people's bonuses or things like that, That's what really is going to drive people's behaviors. So these enacted policies is what you have to look at. If you're really wondering what's going on out there, you've got to look at what's being enacted, not what's been written. So, example, a formal policy is to follow procedures exactly. Enacted policy is, yeah, procedures are important unless we need to meet a production deadline, because my bonus depends on a production deadline. And let me tell you, I have a lot. We've just published our second article that we've had plenty of interviews tell us that workers have this happen all the time, where their supervisors are under a timeline and tell them to use shortcuts and not follow the procedures because of this. So, and I'm sure this is not shocking to you all, but that's an enacted policy. So, so that's the kind of idea that we're talking about. And it's important to understand too, what's reinforcing and what's punishing. So reinforcement and punishment policies are not always tangible. So good policies can be punishing if there's unintended consequence. So if you have a reporting policy that requires lengthy paperwork, then that reporting, people may be very reticent to report because they don't want to have to fill out all that paperwork. Or if it is that you have a stop work authority card that people can pull out of their wallet and flash around, but everybody, including their workers and supervisors, are not going to be sitting at the lunch table with them after they do it, then that is not a reinforcing policy. That's actually a punishing policy, and it's going to decrease that behavior. So you have to be aware of what that worker is going to be living with the actual enacted policies in these domains. And so safety culture and safety climate. Many of you may know this, but it's worth revisiting. Safety culture is those policies and goals where climate is the real attitude and behaviors of the people. How are people actually living? What are people actually living with? And so the attributes of a good culture are where people are committed to safety. They communicate. There's good communication about safety. There's resilience and flexibility, and there's vigilance about safety. And one of the things that we're finding is that you can have a really great, so it is one of the things that we're finding is the importance of this psychosocial element of the context in predicting this interactive behavior. And so this psychosocial part of the context is really that safety climate piece, because you can have somebody that is a very well-designed task. You can have a person who is not fatigued, who is very well motivated, who's the perfect person for the job, and they've got great tools, but you've got a terrible culture where people don't have each other's back, that they really don't feel valued, they don't think that safety is a priority, and you're probably not going to have a very safe environment. Conversely, you can have bad tools and a very good safety climate, and probably you're going to have those workers figuring out a way to work around that. And so this good climate with flexible tools and good people, this is when you get this sort of team effort where people are figuring out how to make this work so that they can get their task done and take care of these people given what they have in this context. And so this is a really important piece because those folks feel empowered. Now, it's not sufficient in and of itself, without question, because if you've got crappy tools, the best climate in the world isn't necessarily going to make a difference. That would not have helped those aviators in World War II. Now, if they had had a better climate, maybe they would have felt empowered to say, this is so frustrating because these two toggle switches are right next to each other. That might have been something that would have facilitated identifying that design error. But it's important to sort of see how these things all fit together. We can't just look at one of these bubbles. We've got to see how these bubbles interact with each other. So now I want to share with you some of the work that we've done on operating procedures. We haven't had a chance yet to investigate emergency procedures or even maintenance procedures, so we've started with operating procedures. So what is a good procedures? What is a good procedure? I've had people tell me that they ensure effective performance of the task, that they should facilitate safety by effectively communicating risk, and that they should document workers' compliance. And regulations and lots of things that should go into these procedures. And I'm starting to think that maybe this isn't really realistic. That can a document be a reliable and effective barrier to hazards? I really don't think so. And I think that this passenger aircraft crash in 1998 is a good example of this, where they knew they were having trouble. They had a fire in in one of the engines, and the pilot was very focused on the checklist. And the co-pilot suggested maybe we should go ahead and descend and start dumping some of the fuel. Pilot said, no, we're not there in the checklist. And by the time he got there in the checklist, it was too late. The checklist said you need to, if all of this doesn't work, you need to descend and dump fuel. It was too late, and unfortunately they crashed and everybody died. And so this is an example where the pilot needed to deviate from that checklist. He needed to look at the context and be aware, use his training, and use the insight of the people that are around him, and to deviate from that checklist. And so this is something that Decker calls the worker's double bind. And I think this is profoundly important for us to be aware of. So this idea that one bind that the worker can be in is when the worker rigidly follows rules when the conditions indicate the procedure is wrong, like the pilot was in. This can lead to unsafe outcomes, and the worker's blamed for application of rules without sensitivity to context. Another situation is that the worker deviates to unanticipated conditions without certainty of outcomes. This may also lead to unsafe outcomes, and the worker's blamed for deviation or non-adherence. So right now, the worker can't win for losing. And so this is from one of the papers in Applied Ergonomics of Decker's. And I really encourage you, if you're interested in this, to read this paper. It's not a difficult paper to read. It's not particularly dense. And he articulates this, I think, very, very nicely. So I would encourage you to read this paper. And in this paper, he elaborates on this idea, and this is some of Honegel's work, and he applies Honegel's work to procedures specifically. And he says that Safety Model 1 in procedures says that procedures should be followed rigidly, and that control of the worker is paramount, and that safety comes from this control. Whereas Safety Model 2 would say that procedures are a resource for action, and that applying procedures successfully is actually a substantive and skillful cognitive activity. And that safety results from being skillful at judging when and how to adapt procedures to those local circumstances. And so Decker says that safety actually comes from organizations monitoring and understanding those reasons behind the gap between procedures and practice. Additionally, organizations must develop ways that support people's skill at judging when and how to adapt. Now, a lot of people get super nervous at this idea because they don't want the workers thinking about adapting procedures. But at the same time, you don't want automatons out there that are just blindly checking off steps and not thinking critically about the work they're doing. So Decker is challenging us to think more critically about what is it that you're wanting the worker to do out there. And that's what we've been looking at as well. And so systematic error is error actually that we can predict. And so systematic error is created by systems that don't support this targeted behavior. Systematic error is when we violate bottom-up and top-down processing, when we have poor safety culture and climate, no support for fatigued workers, and many others, like some of the performance shaping factors associated with human reliability analysis. Humans make errors for other reasons too, like they maybe have a bad day, or they may be sick, maybe they're having financial stressors, personal problems. But these are much less systematic, and they're much harder to predict. So this is more like random error. So What's happening with the World War II pilots, that was systematic error. We can predict it, we can fix it. Some of the other things, that's random error. It's not systematic error. Some of the systematic errors, issues regarding procedures that we found over the about 7 years we've been working on this. Predictors of procedure use. This is just whether or not they pick it up and actually use the document. Task frequency. The more frequent the task, the less they use it, which means we really need a different tool for that, maybe a checklist. Worker experience. The more experienced the worker, the less they use procedures. Again, probably need a different tool. Predictor of good procedure design. Step board length. Different based on worker experience. I think this is fascinating. The more experienced, if you have a more experienced worker and you have a lot of words per step, about 20, they're more likely to make mistakes on that step. If you have a less experienced worker with a lot of words, they're less likely to make mistakes. So this is one of those tool worker interactions that we're talking about, that we need to know both of those pieces of information. Another thing that we found is about hazard statement designs. So you've seen some of those hazard statements that have a box around them, and they've got icons with them, and they're shaded and bolded and all of that sort of stuff. And what we're finding is that the more of that you put around it, ostensibly to try to draw attention to it, the less likely they are to attend to it. And we have done actually some eye tracking studies with it to show that that their attention duration to that, their gaze duration to those types, that design of hazard statements is much lower, significantly lower than if it is just designed like a step. And more importantly, they're more likely to adhere to whatever you put in there if it is designed just like a regular step. So I think we're setting ourselves up for them to not attend to whatever's in that hazard statement if you put too much stuff around it. So some of the other things that we're working on right now with regard to procedures is we're looking at the relationship between procedure change process and safety climate. We're documenting the difference between work as imagined and work as done, and actually how to measure that with some videos of people doing some work with procedures out in the field. We're developing a complexity index for procedures, and particularly a step level complexity index. We're developing design guidelines for digital procedures, accessing organizations, learning how to assess organizations' readiness to adopt digital procedures, developing measures for assessing fatigue in high-risk industries. That is what Dr. Mehta presented about. We're going to be developing some training for emergency response. And we're really interested in collecting the needed data for quantitative risk analysis using human reliability analysis in the chemical processing industry. So I'd be really interested in if anybody's interested in this. So I want to come back, I want to close with being back to this picture, because one of the things as I was getting prepared for this presentation several months ago, I read that the air connectors for opening and closing this valve were identical. There appears to have been no way for a Phillips 66 employee or contract employee to tell whether the valve was rotated open or closed. So literally, this was absolutely a design problem. And I believe that it had to do with how it was, they were set up. They weren't installed correctly. And then also the employees were all very fatigued due to the shift schedules themselves. So we can see that even with this incident itself, we have some contributors based on some of the issues we've been talking about today. So I want to end by talking about my super team, lots of Wonder Women and Supermen. And this list of students changes all the time. I'm always just completely humbled by the people that work with us. My investigators, as you see, Dr. Mehta's on this list, Dr. Hendricks, Sasangahar, McDonald, Mr. Elliot Landard with ATR, Dr. Sam Manan, whom we all miss terribly. This is our website for the Advanced Procedures Initiative. You're welcome to follow us on LinkedIn as well as on Twitter. And I am happy to take any questions or any comments that you may have.
Looks like we have one hand raised.
Do you want me to stop sharing?
Luis, are you on mute? Do you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it fascinating. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, have you have any experience about assistant procedures for operators? For example, rather than having an alarm saying, hey, your temperature is, a message saying your temperature is too high, operate valve ABC, try to put the temperature down, stuff like that. Kind of a dynamic procedures projected into a screen to help as a, like a radio assistant for pilots or something like that.
We actually right now, as we speak, are writing a grant to develop what we're calling a automated adaptive procedures that will adapt to, So because particularly now that digital procedures are becoming adopted by some companies, obviously that will absolutely be a requirement to have adapted procedures. But yeah, we're definitely working on that.
Okay, if you have any information, my name is Luis Garcia from Siemens. If you want help or you want, I would be very interested in knowing about that.
Yes.
Because I think that will take a lot of pressure out of the operator. If the operator there is precise data that tell them what's going on in a simple message, you just told us the more experience the guy has, the shorter the message should be to be efficient. Mm-hmm. So if you have some kind of automation on those messages with level of reliability, that should improve definitely the performance of the operator, and it should take a lot of pressure out of them.
That's what we're hoping. That's our hypothesis.
All right, thank you for your answer.
Yes.
Scott?
Yeah, I was curious. This is actually a two-parter on the comment that you made about the caution icon or the exclamation point or bolding text to draw attention to ensure compliance with a cautionary statement. If the data supports that it is so often ignored, first question is, why then is it practiced so extensively and globally, regardless of whether it's just buying a new phone or buying a vacuum cleaner or something? Everybody does it. And the second part is, if that is so ineffective, what then is the most effective way to actually do get appropriate attention in completing a critical step?
Great questions. So the things that we see in for consumer products like a phone or medicine bottles or cigarettes or alcohol or things like that, much of the literature that's out there currently, much of the science that's out there right now is based on consumer product labeling, and or even on the labeling of something that someone is going to see on a device or a physical object. There is very, 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 very little. We actually couldn't find anything on how these should be, that were empirical studies on how these should be designed when they're in a manual. And so what we're finding is that that's the difference. And so I think that everyone assumed that it was the same. And so what we're finding is it's not the same, is that what's effective in this idea where you're seeing multiple pieces of hazard information. If you think about, when you open a manual to build anything, you've got those first, million pages of cautions and warnings that some people read a lot, particularly people who have been in engineers or people who have been in or in safety or whatever they might read, or people who just are particularly careful, but most people don't. Most people don't read manuals, but and so I think that's the reason that we see it so much. Very effective in consumer product stuff and on devices. What we're seeing is not effective in this procedure written document domain. So that's the answer to your first question. Based on what we know so far, and we are 3 years into this, so and I haven't seen anybody else do any other research, which we need to. It can't be just my shop doing this. It needs to be somebody else doing this to replicate it. Based on what we've done so far, we have found that the ones that look the closest to a step, that you have a step that you want them to do, and you put the hazard information in there, what the hazard is, what the consequence is, what the mitigation is, that you just embed it in the information, that's when they pay attention to it, because it's part of the task that they're doing. It makes people nervous because it's so counterintuitive, but that's what we have found so far.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
David? Mr. Hanson?
Yes, hello. Have you done any research into the effectiveness of words versus images? I see a lot more use now in procedures of images, and I would think they're more effective for most people.
It depends on what their level is. So newer, less experienced folks love images. More experienced. Now, let me take this back. We haven't done any empirical studies on that. In the interviews that we did, particularly the first round of interviews that we did, that's what the interviewee said. The less experienced one were like, it's so great when they have the pictures on there and they tell us a lot of stuff. And the more experienced one said, it just drives me crazy when they have all these pictures and it makes the procedures too long. And why don't they just tell me what they want me to do? I already know how to do it. And so there's two kinds of pictures too. There are pictures that are actually of the equipment that they're about to touch. And then there are pictures that are more graphical representations of a hazard or things like that. And we did a study, kind of back to the hazard statement study. And we did a study with the Center for Operator Performance many years ago, and looked to see if using the if the type of hazard image we used would make a difference, particularly for those individuals who were non-native English speakers. And we did not find any effect. It was more about it being too busy. Just more stuff on the hazard statement made them less likely to look at it.
Any other questions? So, Camille, you were talking about how you've studied what people are paying attention to and what they're reacting to. How do you do that?
Well, we've done it the coolest way that we've done it most recently is with the eye tracking study. And so with the eye tracking study, what we did is we have a virtual reality warehouse, and we have a bunch of different tasks, kind of your classic warehouse tasks where people, you have to, use a forklift to get product off of a barge and into the, onto a forklift, and then the forklift takes that product that's in one of those giant bags to, some other place to, put it here, moving stuff around to, change products from one status to another status. and you have to charge the forklift, and you then there's fans that you have to clean and all of this kind of stuff. And then, of course, we have corresponding procedures with all of these tasks. And so we have people do the procedures at a computer, and the procedure was like a PDF at the computer, and then the digital, the Second Life world was on the other side, and so we could see. And then they had eye tracking glasses on that tracked where they were looking at the procedure. And then we had them do that with procedures that had different designs that we had tested before. And so we could measure very precisely how long they looked at the different designs of the hazard statements. And so, and then we also measured whether or not they did whether or not they put on the PPE, whether or not they turned off the, whether or not they did the lockout tag out correctly, whether or not they, checked whether or not the power was on, these sorts of hazard, the mitigating factors that associated with the hazard statement. And so, so does that sort of explain it? That's kind of the best way to note whether or not they've attended to it, is that eye tracking, is just how long they looked at it.
Okay, because if you ask somebody if they're paying attention, they always say yes.
Exactly. And one of the things that's really interesting, because I know that the virtual, reality has, warehouse, I would imagine, doesn't seem very applicable to the real world, and it certainly isn't. But we did one study before we had the eye tracker. We did one study where we found that people were not doing the things in the safety statement that had all the stuff around it, like I said before, and were more likely to do it with it just looking like a step. And so then what we did is we also did another study that was at Roberts Training Facility in Louisiana, that is where they had a three-phase separation system. And that's where people, and we had trained, we had people that were experienced and inexperienced operators doing these tasks. And we had that same manipulation with the icon and without the icon. And then we got even a bigger difference between whether or not they attended to it or not. And with, again, in the same direction. But they told us, the operators told us, like, oh yeah, it's so important to have that icon. I'm much more likely to pay attention to that hazard statement if the icon is there. And so, Angela, you're absolutely right. It just feels like that it's just going to draw your attention, and I'm more likely to look at it. And but it was such a huge effect. It was very dramatic. And I think that Eloise has got the point. She's saying that the operator's focused on doing the job, which is to complete the steps. And so what they're doing is they're seeing if there's any indication that this information here is not associated with my steps, they are skipping it. And it's a phenomenon called banner blindness. And if you think about the next time you go to a website, and if you've got a very specific task that you're doing, you'll ignore all the stuff around it that you think is not related to your task. And that's where that came up, that phenomenon was identified. And so I think that you're absolutely right, Eloise. It's just not associated with their task.
Herman?
I'm curious about, a lot of procedures are just step, you're done. But some procedures involve a decision. There's a condition, and you have to decide which way to go next, and you can branch. And it seems like there would be some extra interesting studies around branching decisions and things like that, and experienced versus inexperienced, and well written versus not so clear, and especially the branches that aren't documented, like error recovery or things like that. And I was just wondering, how much has all of that been studied?
Very little. Very little. What we're doing right now is we're trying to be able to document the complexity of each step. So we're building a complexity index that documents step complexity, with the idea being that it would be an automated process, kind of like Word does, that lets you know that, well, the grammar check that tells you that you don't have word subject or verb subject agreement, and that it could tell the procedure writer that, hey, this is a complex step because of fill in the blank, maybe because there's a decision in it. Now, the decision may need to stay. Obviously, if there's a decision, there's a decision. But then the writer may just want to be particularly intentional about not having, sort of error traps in there or things like that. But just to flag those steps that are more complex. And then sometimes complexity can be written out. Sometimes there's multiple steps that are put into a step that maybe it'd be better to just have it be, have it be multiple steps and instead of having them all in one step. And so, but the branching piece of it, I think, is what I have seen in some of the digital procedure formats. That's where digital procedures can really be helpful as well, because then you can get that branching, and sometimes the value can even, the current value of that state of that process can even be populated, which can support the worker in making that decision. And so that's when you get some really nice and elegant support for the worker. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Well, I use flowcharts a lot when we're going through something complex, and I'm just wondering how much does stuff like that help as opposed to just verbal. When you're describing branches, it can be sometimes a flowchart or something can help a lot. That's hard to use in the field sometimes, though.
Exactly.
But it can be very helpful on screen. I've seen that done, and I haven't seen that much study work on that kind of a thing.
We haven't investigated that yet, but like I said, I have seen some interesting displays with the visuals of the digital displays, where they'll display a step, and then there'll be kind of a yes, no, and if yes, then it does some kind of branching. It's not quite a flow chart like what you're talking about. But one of the things that I think is really cool and very promising about digital displays is that it's entirely possible to pop up an image, and particularly for those inexperienced workers, to pop up a flow chart and say, this is the process that you're about to go through, and help them orient themselves to it. Because that's a lot of what they're trying to do that first 7 years, is just to really get themselves comfortable with this entire complex process. And I think for the more senior folks, a lot of times their assumption is that they know that process. It may not be that they're aware of, let's say, a context change that's happening at that point in the process. They may not be aware of the risks associated with that context change. And that may be where a flow chart could help as well. I think it's an interesting question, Herman. I'm not familiar with it, but it's a good empirical question.
Dave, you're up.
I'm going to give Camille a breather and ask Nick Sands a question. Zork procedures?
You didn't play Zork?
Zork procedures?
It was the text-based computer games where, depending on what choice you made, it took you into the next direction.
Yeah, not familiar with it. That's why I had to ask.
Intelligent procedures here would be, I would think, would be similar. Depending on what your result of the step was, it would tell you the next steps to take.
Right.
Oh, Zork is a game?
It's a very old computer game.
Okay, I missed that one. You must be older than me.
No, not really.
You're very young at heart, though, Dave.
Justin?
Yeah, thank you. So I used to do some software training, and I always noticed when people were learning software or using software, if they had a mouse, their eye tends to follow the mouse cursor. And I would almost see them doing a little swirly pattern, just kind of hoping the mouse would land magically on the button that they wanted. And I was wondering if you saw any differences with touch screens and their design versus sort of mouse design screens with people's maybe functionally working the screen.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought and I haven't done any interface, basic, because that's some basic research interface design stuff, and I haven't done that because what you're talking about, and what's that called? I mean, it's the whole searching for internet links, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't do that with a touch screen because it moves the screen up and down. And so what's the equivalent of that behavior?
I would literally go and put my hand on the mouse to stop the mouse from moving and ask them to just look at the screen, and then suddenly they'd see it.
Yeah.
But the mouse is somehow magically, like, it distracts them, I think.
Yeah. That's fascinating. That's really, really interesting.
That's interesting.
Yeah, well, so I don't know if the sort of the modern push towards touchscreen tablets and such is going to change how we look at HMI design, because potentially your finger is now the source versus a mouse in some cases. Obviously not in maybe control rooms, but peripheral, tasks.
Well, I think that a lot of these procedures, these digital procedures, are on tablets. So in the control rooms, and in what I was looking at, even in the control rooms, they were using the digital procedures on tablets. They were separated from the system itself.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, which was actually a real challenge because, and of course, you've got the people that were all high about it, and then the people who were doom and gloom, and which all are important. It's important to listen to all of those people, actually, because one of the doom and gloom people who had been there for a while said, these tablets time out. And now all my emergency procedures are on these tablets. And when I'm in an emergency and there's an issue, then a lot of times what happens is I'm dealing with somebody and I'm calling people and I'm talking to people, and it's going to time out. And so then when I come back to it, I'm going to have to log on, and God forbid it has to go through an update while I'm during that period, because it goes through updates in the most random moments. And which is real. He was not making that up. They'd all experienced where it would just all of a sudden, the tablets would all of a sudden go into update mode, and that they had to log back in pretty that it timed out, and then they had to log back in. So that's not your point that you were originally making. That's a little bit of an aside, but it's interesting. Yeah, and I think that's but I'm so curious. I'm going to have to talk to my colleagues that do that kind of work, because I got more into the more focused, or I guess more applied stuff than that. But that's a hardcore HCI question, is what that is.
It's an interesting point you've raised, Justin, because it's funny in the trying to get the office going in the light of COVID back in February. One of the things was we started looking at, well, when do we touch other people's stuff? There's the touching of your face or touching other people's stuff. And what we found was that whenever somebody came into an office and wanted to show something to someone on a computer, they wanted to touch that person's mouse. They couldn't just say, hey, and point at the screen and say, go here. If they couldn't touch the person's mouse, it was like they couldn't show the person. So it's kind of the opposite of your example of where the individual is trying to find it. I've seen mentors do the same thing. So we had the office protocol was, you go into someone's office, you don't touch any of their things. You put your hands behind your back and you describe where on the screen you want them to go. But it was I didn't realize how often I did it until I told myself I couldn't anymore. And then I realized, man, I was reaching for, it must be a control freak thing. I want to touch their keyboard. but maybe it's just the human aspect of the mouse and the screen and what we consider our interface to the presentation of that information.
Yeah,
Well,
because
and
you also find people will kind of almost calibrate where the mouse is on the screen. So they'll kind of wiggle the mouse and they'll sort of circle the screen, and it's calibrating their hand to know where the range of motion is for the mouse. And you just do it without even thinking now. But you watch anybody walk up to a computer and they'll sort of wiggle the mouse and get a feel for how that cursor speed is, right? And they'll adjust it. But when you have a finger, you're sort of holding back and just looking, and then you just pop it with your finger. So it was just an interesting thought process to think of how, are we more efficient because we're forcing ourselves to look at the screen and find the thing we're looking for? Or, because now we know with our own finger, we know immediately where the cursor is, right? Versus that kind of like, oh, let me wiggle this and find it, and now I can go off and do my thing.
Very interesting. Dave, did you have another comment?
No, is my hand still up?
yes, you've
Oh,
got two
sorry.
hands up actually. So, Angela, if there's not another comment, this is, I want to share with you because I actually did a lot of my dissertation on this. This is another sort of basic research thing, but it's very interesting. So I think a big part of that phenomenon that people experience, because everybody does this, it's not you, everybody does what we call the lean move, where you're watching somebody do something differently than you do on a computer. Or anything. I would say, we've all been in the car with somebody who's driving differently than you do, and it kind of makes you crazy. Some of us more than others. But if somebody's, messing with a widget in a way that you don't like the way they're messing with that widget, you want to do it differently. But particularly on a computer, if they are doing it slowly or inefficiently, or how to get to that file, and they don't know how to get to that file, and they're only doing, moving their mouse to the file menu and drop down to save, and you use keyboard shortcuts, it is like nails on a chalkboard. And what we'll do is this lean move until you finally are like, hey, can I drive? Let me just drive, and I'll be able to get us there real quickly. And so one of the things because this is the reason I'm bringing this up, because I'm doing my little tutorial on information processing. And so one of the things that we think it may be is we have something in the brain that's been very well established. It's called mirror neurons. And so when we see something happening in the world, even if we're not doing it, the neurons that would be activated if we were doing it get activated. So it's almost this mirror of our doing it. And so if we're anticipating that somebody's going to open a file in a particular place in a particular way, then those neurons activate. And if it's contrary to what we're expecting, there's a tension there, and it feels uncomfortable. And so then we want to relieve that tension somehow by just doing it ourselves. And so could be a great way to learn. I think that's also one of the ways that experts might be able to identify when something's not right, because it's just their mirror neurons are activated and they're not seeing what they're expecting. But just so there's something for your gee whiz bag next time somebody asks you about.
Yeah.
Say about mirror
I now
neurons.
have something new I can say. No, I'm not a control freak. It's just that you're stimulating my mirroring neurons.
There you go. There you go, Angela.
Luis?
Yeah, I was going to say that sometimes the use of the mouse could be a way to, to search or to scan. Sometimes you have an open, lots of files, and you're looking for a file, and you try to go in an orderly manner. And yes, you use the pointer so that you check each one to make sure it's not by, So people try to it's like Justin was saying, it's like magic. The eye follow, but sometimes it's used for searching in an orderly manner. at least I use that technique and I find things faster.
That makes sense.
Additional questions or comments? Camille,
I think we're there.
yeah. Camille, I got one more question. Camille, there's, been a lot of, while your discussion's been kind of general on procedures, there has been the flare that it is has a lot to do with operating procedures. Does the same sort of issues play into maintenance procedures, assembly procedures, where the length of the step or the warning, does it matter whether it's an operating procedure, assembly procedure, or maintenance, or are they all kind of the same issues? We're humans, and it's not the procedure problem, it's us.
Well, I would say the other way around. One, it's not us, it's the procedure, procedure design. Yeah. I think so that I feel pretty comfortable with that. Now, granted, knowing that we all make mistakes at some times, but making sure that the procedure is designed particularly for the task, and making sure that it's supporting those, given the type of task they're trying to do, that worker is trying to do in that context, that makes a big difference. And it's important to note that operating procedures are very different than maintenance procedures. And so the types of issues that we found, the specific issues, I would imagine probably maybe not the hazard statement issues, that may be universal, but there's so much troubleshooting that's going on with maintenance procedures that they're using. The training is so important. They're really talk about needing to do, a whole decision tree. They're really just trying to isolate variables. Is it if it's just maintenance and they're just saying, okay, I want to make sure that this is in good condition, but still, what does good condition mean? You've got to test this, and then if this doesn't look right, well, then there's several things you could do. And so the troubleshooting piece of maintenance procedures, I would think, would require a very different set of procedures, and it would be more of a toolkit than a step-by-step. And I would imagine it would almost be like a checklist with links to the resources they need. And they've got to be sufficiently trained to be able to use that checklist. But I'm talking off the top about, I do know that I'm right about their tasks being very different. But I'm doing some guessing about what would be a good design difference.